Welcome everyone to another Out of the Depths. Tonight we're lucky to be joined by Jeff Jackson of Algonquin Fly Fishing, Eastern Ontario's premier guiding service and Algonquin Park's only dedicated fly fishing guide. We've done a video with you before on brook trout in Algonquin. Tonight we're going to mix up a bit, go a little further east, talk about some bass, maybe some other species too. Yeah, this should be fun. Welcome back.
Yeah, great. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm pleased to spend some time with you. So I'm a fly fishing guide here in the Ottawa Valley. So Pembroke, Ontario is my home. That means in the spring, it's Algonquin Park, primarily the east side of Algonquin Park. And then that's the month of May. And then come mid-June, July, August, it's all drift boat fly fishing for bass primarily. But I'm going to talk to you about, you can fish for just about everything around here, which makes this a pretty special spot. So on Chris's point, the borders are pretty nebulous for what's the Ottawa Valley. There's the geographic Ottawa Valley, and then there's the kind of frame of mind. People would say here they're a valley person. It's kind of it's a bit of a cultural specialty here, but that's really the Ottawa River watershed. Primarily, when we say Ottawa Valley, we mean the Ontario side, but the Pontiac, which is the Quebec side of the Ottawa River, that's in the category too. And it's basically upstream of Ottawa, south of Mattawa. That's the Ottawa Valley. It's a big open agricultural valley, and talk about the waterways that are in there. So we're in FMZ 15. So that's a really big fishing management zone, which means we share the same rules as Perry Sound. But that makes sense because we're the same geology. That's all Precambrian shield, basically all been scraped clean by the last ice age. Algonquin Park anchors it. The west side of Algonquin Park is the height of land, and basically everything west of Algonquin Park goes to Georgian Bay. Everything in Algonquin Park goes to the Ottawa Valley. So that's the height of land that splits this whole thing. So we're talking about the east side. So the east of Algonquin Park is in the Ottawa Valley, but I'm leaving that out. As Chris said, I did a webinar, I think over a year ago, and go and check that out. It's Ottawa, it's Algonquin Park specific, brook trout specific story. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on brook trout tonight because you got a whole hour and a half of it over there. So this is a really neat spot. I didn't know that when I was growing up, but it's got an amazing fishing history and a fishing legacy, which I'm going to use that as to kind of frame the story of what we're doing here now. So there's the Algonquin Park story, and it became a park in 1893. So it's well documented, and that really anchors much of what we know, our science about our region, what we know about lake trout and brook trout all come from Algonquin Park. And because it's a park, it's had regulations and a history, and it's well documented, and we can kind of lean on that to understand our fishing heritage way more here than another region would have that access to that information. So Ottawa Valley, that's the Ottawa River watershed you're looking at. Geographically, you can see it's much more in Quebec than it is in Ontario. However, most of the water comes from Ontario. The Petawawa and the Madawaska are both major rivers in their own right, and yet they're tributaries to the Ottawa River. Ottawa River is 1,400 kilometers long. It goes on it's a peculiar river because the Gatineau, which flows directly into downtown Ottawa, or Gatineau, Quebec side of Ottawa, and the Ottawa River share the same headwaters. They share the same pond. It flows east into the Gatineau, and it's like 150 kilometers to Ottawa, or it goes west, way across the Northern Lakes, all the way down through Temiskaming, through Mattawa, through the Ottawa Valley, 1,400 kilometer journey, which could have been shortcutted the other way. Just one of those glitches in geology, how the river ended up shaping itself. So I'll talk a little bit about the Ontario and the Quebec side, mostly the Ontario side, but I will ensure to include the other side. So if you say the Ottawa Valley, that's primarily Renfrew County. So that's the biggest county in Ontario, and it's the least populated county in Ontario. So once you go north of Mattawa, North Bay, that's unincorporated. There's no counties up there. It's just Crown land. But as far as counties go, we're the biggest and the least populated. We're the size of Prince Edward Island. So that's the geographic range and the scope of what we're doing here. The map you can see, green is Crown land. So there's a lot of crown land in Renfrew County. 60% of the land mass is crown land. The purpley spot you see there, that's actually a big military base, Petawawa military base. And then the white is private, and then there's other colors in there for county land and municipal park and so on. So a lot of open, easily accessible space here, which is one of our unique features that gives us what we have. We're a land of rivers and we're a land of lakes. So Ottawa Valley Tourism hung their hat on this a long time ago as they're calling themselves a whitewater capital of Canada. This is 15 years ago. They were pushing this idea, and paddling tourism is a big deal here. So Algonquin Park, whitewater rafting, it's a big thing of what we do. Fun fact, that's me in the red kayak in this ad. So I'm a whitewater paddler, and that's where my history as a youth was, in whitewater, before I ever stumbled into fly fishing, although it took me to all the rivers where I discovered fly fishing. So if we've got the rafting scene in Beachburg, so there's several big whitewater rafting companies. They attract probably 15,000 tourists a summer to come whitewater rafting. And then we've got Algonquin Park, which sees something in the range of 200,000 people a year visit Algonquin Park. And anybody traveling in from the east side is going to be coming up through the Ottawa Valley to get there. So to give you a sense of what this place looks like, we've got some big water. So some really big lakes. So let's see, that's Calabogie Lake on the top left. That's Golden Lake on the top right. And the bottom, that's the Ottawa River on the bottom, which is, other than a couple sections of moving fast water, it's dam impoundments and huge lakes. So this is this is downtown Pembroke. You can see upstream here about 15 kilometers, and it's about 4 kilometers wide. Huge water, right? So lots of big motorboat fishing going on here, which I'll bump into, but that's definitely not my thing. I'm going to talk more about some of the smaller water that we'd see that's a little more realistic for a fly fishing standpoint. So there's all sorts of little ponds, little mini, so lakes, small lakes, and then what I would say ponds, meaning a really good stone throw might get all the way across it. And you can canoe into these, hike into these, take a drift boat. Canoe is really the historical means of doing it and gives you the most options, but float tubes are perfectly viable. You're not going to see anybody else in most cases when you go fishing a little pond or a little lake around here. There's just so many options for where you end up going fishing. So lakes, big ones. We've got Golden Lake, Lake Clear, Lake Dory, Calabogie Lake, big cottage scenes, cottage rentals. There's lots of business and it's very easy to get a hold of a place there. And many people cottage summer there and then go exploring off to go fish either in the big lake or off in the little rivers and the little lakes around it. So rivers are what we do. It's what we've got. And that's why I live here. It's from my where I parked right now and just outside of Pembroke, I live in the country. I can get to probably 6 different river runs, 6 different rivers within a 20-minute drive. So there's so many options for what you want to do. So the big one across the bottom, that's the Madawaska, drains the southern part of Algonquin Park. The Bonnechere is the next one up. It drains into Renfrew. It too starts in Algonquin Park, drains into Renfrew. Then we've got the Petawawa, which drains into downtown Petawawa. On the Quebec side, the major rivers are from north to south, the Des Moines, the Clunge, and the Noir, the Black. So those are the major drainages, all major rivers in their own right. So for you Southern Ontario folks, all of those rivers would be bigger than the Grand River, other than maybe below Cambridge. It gets a little bit bigger, but they're all significant rivers. The landscape is classic Canadian canoe rivers, right? So big rocks, pine trees, nice rapids, portages around all this stuff. People camp all over all these rivers have canoe tripping and camping going all along them, which is the traditional way to really experience a fishing trip in the Ottawa Valley. Lots of options, even though it's let's say a canoeing whitewater river, lots of options for waded fishing in all sorts of these places, especially if you're comfortable in a boat and can get around or willing to walk around rapids. You've got lots and lots of options for where to fish. And then there's the rafting scene, right? So you can see the rocks are very similar everywhere. Big blocky granite rocks, pine forest, quite picturesque everywhere that you look on this waterway. So what I do then in the summer, I've got the Algonquin Park Spring, and then in the summer is all drift boat, either on the Petawawa, the Madawaska, or the Ottawa itself, which is then smallmouth bass fishing. But it's lovely. It's the kind of traditional class 1, class 2 splashy river kind of float trip with lots of eddies and lots of pools to be fishing. So I love spending the summer on the boat. That's super ideal, and that's what I'd recommend anybody who's interested in a guided trip. I'll push you that way because it's just so fun. We've also got these classic big beautiful canoe tripping rivers. This is the Noir, the Black River in Quebec. Huge sand beaches. It's remarkable, beautiful spots. You know, it blows people away, and it's a destination for canoers from around the country, around the world, honestly. If I were to give you the top 3 canoe trips in Canada, 2 of them are in the Ottawa Valley. So I'd say go to the Nahanni in the Yukon, do the Petawawa in Algonquin Park, and do the Des Moines in Quebec. Both the Des Moines and the Quebec, the Des Moines and the Petawawa are just right here. So if we've got all these big rivers, obviously there's lots of feeder streams. There's all these little creeks and streams all over the place, with little dead end roads that get to them, or ATV trails that travel along them, and you can float them, or you can wade them, or bushwhack along the edges. If you look at any topographic map or Google Earth, you're going to see a whole spider web of water, and there's fish in all that water. What species is a little bit dependent on temperature and the other species. The bass have gobbled up the brook trout a long time ago in any of the lower warm water. So the brook trout have been eaten up and competed. Up high, when it gets colder, all of these little streams are going to hold brook trout, and then eventually hits a lake. That lake's probably got pike. That lake's probably got some smallmouth bass, and then below that it becomes bass water and musky water. So I'll kind of outline that a little bit here. What else? So FMZ 15, this little chart shows all of the fishing management zones, expenditures in fishing in millions of dollars. The tallest line there is FMZ 15. We're a major fishing region. So 30% more fishing expenditures in this region than any other place in Ontario. So we think about all of the fishing going on in Northern Ontario, the guided fishing, the hunting fishing lodges, all this stuff there. There's more spending in FMZ 15. So cottage rentals, boat rentals, not a lot of guide service, some guide work in there, but a lot of DIY rent and go and fish and find it on your own. And then the locals fish. So that's the #1 summer pastime here. So I want to go back a little bit and just talk about history, which I can get super excited about. I know I do get super excited about, and I'm not going to spend the hour here, but there's a whole story here. This picture's from 1896, guided fly fishing in Algonquin Park. Isn't that amazing? 1896, we've got a guiding fishing heritage here. All fishing was fly fishing in those days, right? It wasn't until the Second World War that there was an alternative to fly fishing, but there's a really rich heritage here. So not only do we have Algonquin Park with its documented heritage with photos and all sorts of interesting facts that go around that, the Quebec side, so if that's anchoring the the west side, over on the Quebec side, there's been a fishing culture there ever since the late 1800s, 1880s. So here's what happened. New York City is the biggest city in the world. That's where all the rich people were. Biggest city in North America. All the rich people are there. They go fishing in the Catskills. That's got rich tradition in fly fishing. The Catskills get logged out, and the habitat degradation, fishing goes downhill. They move to the Adirondacks. Adirondacks gets popular, gets logged out, but built up. Those same people move to the Ottawa Valley for their summer vacations. So the Des Moines Rod and Gud Club, the oldest continuous hunting fishing club in Canada, is right here in the Ottawa Valley, started in 1918 and still exists to today. You can join, it's quite reasonably priced, which gets you access to their backcountry lodges, in quotation marks. They're really old cabins, but you have access to stay in these things, on fish on these lakes, and they have a big tract of land. 1880 was actually the first hunting fishing club, which was all formed by Adirondack rich people. So Paul Smith, if anybody drives down to Lake Placid, you go through the little four corners called Paul Smith's. There's a university there named after this person. He was a hotelier in downtown New York, was a rich. He started hotels in Saranac Lake. That's where he made his fortune, moved them up into the Des Moines Valley, and he started Tramp's Retreat, which was a luxury wilderness lodge with 24 rooms, and people had to take the train in and go in by horseback and go and fish all these amazing backcountry rivers, backcountry streams, and lake fishing, right? So anyways, there's the whole story. That existed up until 1970, and that historic backcountry lodge thing. And in 1970, I'll kind of talk about there's a fundamental change in Quebec, which kind of like mothballed that whole history, even though that the the Des Moines Club still exists. Here's chapter 2 in the history. I'm a boat person. I love boats. I love whitewater. The modern drift boat that we all see pictures of in fly fishing, it was invented in Pembroke, kind of. The Cockburn pointer boat wasn't invented in Pembroke. So in the 1860s, this style of boat, the pointed ends, the flat bottom, was designed for logging. So it could run rapids and follow the logs downstream as the whole logging industry is moving logs down to market. So in Pembroke, these boats were made. They're producing upwards of 30 boats a day, shipping them across North America to all of the different logging zones all across the country. Made their way up, go on the railroad, made their way out to British Columbia, made their way down into Washington and Oregon, where in the 1930s, unemployed boat builders modified them and turned them into the modern Mackenzie River drift boat. So that history and that legacy is anchored to a workshop that still exists in Pembroke today. It's now a flooring shop. They make hardwood floors. They haven't produced any boats since 1969. Amazing part of the story. And I love that here I am at the heart of this, running drift boat trips, right, with a boat that was designed over 150 years ago right here. So the photo on the left is loggers running rapids in drift boats. And then today, that's my boat, right? So that same style has been modified a little bit to suit the needs of fishing and running whitewater specifically, as opposed to the old rules. Okay. The third chapter, and the one that really matters from our fishing standpoint, is the landscape, what we've got here. So we were covered in the last ice age, 11,000 years ago. There was a kilometer worth of ice over top of my head that depressed the land. That ice sheet melted and pushed back north, and that allowed the sea to come in. And that created the geology that we've got right now. So the height of land at Algonquin Park split the watershed. Some went into the Great Lakes, and whatever else came down the Ottawa Valley in what was called the Champlain Sea. So there's actually whale bones, so fossilized whale bones here in the Ottawa Valley, because at one point we were under seawater. And then as the land slowly rebounded and lifted, it pushed that out. And then the outflows became the Petawawa River and then the Madawaska River, which were major rivers at that time, draining the melting ice sheet. That's why we've got no soil here. It's all rock, right? So where I live is right on the border between south of me is agriculture and north of me is trees. There's no agriculture north of where I live because I'm right on the edge of where the ice sheet would have stopped. So temperature wise, we're a little drier here in the Ottawa Valley than the west side of the province. That's because that height of land at Algonquin Park streams out some of that water and it just basically acts as a barrier. And we're a little bit warmer than the average spot for the kind of northern Ontario or central Ontario where we exist. What could you expect? Typical summer day here is kind of like 15 degrees at night and 25 during the day. And of course, things are getting warmer, and that's changing everything these days, but that's our kind of traditional summer. This graph on the left is our ice out. So this is tracked in Algonquin Park, and it's been tracked for 100 years, but you can see ice out is slowly getting earlier and earlier. So, and that's simply a climate change story. We're having a cool spring so far, but that could turn around pretty quick. Ice out here is the end of April. The smaller lakes, the lower lakes, and the rivers open up earlier, but they track that on Opeongo Lake. The graph on the right is average temperature. So that's average annualized temperature, and you can see it's going up. So that's the climate change story is really what we're looking at. So earlier ice outs and slightly warmer days, which are going to change the geography and going to change the geology and going to change the fish habitat here. Brook trout are in trouble, lake trout are in trouble because of we're losing our cold water. Okay, more specifically for what we're talking about for fishing then in the Ottawa Valley. This graph, I've zeroed out everything except for FMZ 15, the species most fished for in this region. So red on the bottom is walleye. People here are walleye crazy. The locals are walleye crazy. They all fish walleye. They have no use for anything else. So red is walleye. Green is northern pike. So there's a fair northern pike movement here. Purple's bass. Obviously lots of bass fishing. It's so accessible. Smallmouth primarily. A little bit of largemouth bass going on. Lake trout and then other. So that other would be brook trout, right? So Algonquin Park being the kind of heart of brook trout fishing for this fishing management zone. That's what ends up in that category. So walleye and bass is really the prime species, the prime target around here. everybody's eating walleye. Nobody's doing catch and release walleye fishing around here. There's quite a bit of catch and release smallmouth bass fishing, especially trophy smallmouth bass fishers are probably letting lots of their take go. Not particularly good eating, especially by August when it's really warm water. Most folks would choose not to eat bass at that point. The taste is not there, and some of them are going to be infected with worms. So what do we got? The seasons. So it kind of lays out like this. We've got a lot of fishing opportunities, some of which are more ambitious for fly anglers than otherwise. So if we were to say the ice out is about the end of April, roughly. So brook trout is open January 1st, except in Algonquin Park, but everywhere else it's open January 1st. So when it was open for ice fishing, and then when it's ice out, that becomes brook trout season. So that's all of May is going to be brook trout season. So ice breaks the end of late April. All of May, we've got ice, brook trout fishing. Walleye opens then the third Saturday in May, right? So brook trout bleeds right into the walleye season. The first couple of weeks of walleye season, totally fly fishable. I'll talk about that in a second. Once the water gets warm, they go deep and they're kind of out of the game for us anyways. That same opening day, pike opens, and pike fishing is great around here, especially in May and June. It's super active and they're easy to find and they're big and it's really, really fun fishing. I really enjoy that. Musky opens just a couple weeks later. Same thing. Early fishing for musky is good. And typically, if you're fishing for walleye, you're going to run into musky in a lot of places because walleye are chasing them at the same time. Vice versa. Musky are chasing the walleye at the same time. And then bass opens the fourth Saturday in June, which is pretty late. And that's actually, there's a proposal to move that the MNR is talking about moving that up a week to the third weekend in June. Regardless, then you got all of July, August, and into September for bass fishing. And then it starts to cool down and it goes in return. The only thing to note is that trout closes September 30th. Everything else stays open later and longer into the cold weather, and it slows down to the point where it might be open, but it's slows down. The water's so cold that it's not great fishing any longer. All right, if you have any questions, you can just squirt them out there. This is rainbow smelt. Rainbow smelt are seen as a invasive species in almost everywhere, except in the Ottawa Valley. They're native because we were at one point covered in salt water, right? We were a different different geographic zone, different geological zone. They're native to this region. So that means that just about everything eats them. So rainbow smelt spawn in the spring. They school up into these massive pods and they head to the shallows where it's warm. So they spawn around the edges of lakes and at the mouths of rivers. So everything follows them. That's the simple version. If you want to fish here, fly fish in the spring for lake trout, brook trout, or walleye, pike, musky, you're going to fish something white. You're going to basically replicate rainbow smelt because that's what the fish are going to be charging into the shallows to find these guys. That's great news for us for fly fishing because the action is in the shallow water. It's cold. Nothing's yet gone deep. So the Scotty McFly is the standard around here. It totally works. It's just got you just make it a little bit of a rainbow smelty kind of stomach to it. You've got some other options around Murdich minnows or any of the other kind of zonker families that's got some white tail to it. That's all totally viable. So that's our spring story right there. Second spring story is either white horse sucker or white sucker or red horse sucker. Right, one of those two, they're both in this region and they grow pretty big. They school up and they spawn in the spring. So the bigger fish are definitely chasing those. So if you're chasing pike or musky, anything in the kind of like the sucker colors, with the kind of dark back, yellow stomach, that's what they're doing. And you can see them chasing them. Anywhere where any of the mouths of the streams where the suckers are spawning, there's going to be big fish patrolling just out of sight out there. So those are the two prime forage species. If we're going to talk about smallmouth bass in particular, we've got two options here. We've got crayfish of all sorts of different colors, and they change through the year. So as the water gets warmer, they get more orange, but there's some watersheds where the crayfish are green. And right next door, there'll be a watershed where the crayfish are orange. So literally one watershed to the next. So you need to just kick some rocks and see what color what color the crayfish are. Amazing color differences. So depending on which river I'm fishing, it got slightly different versions of what flies I'm going to be using because of the color that are in those. So that's the Bonachère, the green. Bonachère River crayfish are green. The Petawawa, they're much oranger. The Madawaska, way more orange. So those are all just local speciation idea developments out of there. So that's the kind of standard fly for me right there, which is just this kind of like flashy, coppery, call it a crayfish, fine, but it's really just about the color is what we're replicating, and it's pretty reliable, especially around the Ottawa River where they're very rusty colored crayfish. So on that note, rusty crayfish as an invasive species, we've got them. They're here. So you can fish those variations, which are kind of greeny, but they're big. So that's what we can fish, a bigger crayfish, because the fish are used to seeing big crayfish. That map is showing the red dots are where their presence is detected, which is all up through the Ottawa watershed. So we've got them, and they're bad news because they're pushing out the native species, changing the food mass. All right, native salmon in Boulter Lake, which is right over near Bancroft, kind of Maynooth area. It's the only lake, certainly in FMZ 15, that has native salmon that are persisting there. Sorry, not native, wild salmon. They would have been planted 100 years ago, and they just happen to stick there, and they've never stuck anywhere else. So crazy. I've never fished that lake. I'm not going to go cruising
I've never
there.
heard of kokanee this far east.
Yeah, yeah, isn't that crazy? To fish them, you're going to be trolling on sinking lines. You know, that's traditional salmon fishing. Then in that case, lake fishing.
Interesting. We did have one question. If you'll find multiple colors of crayfish in the same water bodies.
No, you got one or the other. Yeah. So kick some rocks, and that's what you're going to get for the whole day. And 30 kilometers downstream, you're going to get the same color. It's fascinating. Fascinating story. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the fishing, and I'm going to kind of tour the different species here and just kind of frame what the expectations might look like and how you're going to approach this. So brook trout, like I said, I don't want to spend a lot of time on brook trout because you've got some of those options to find that info that I've talked about before. Primarily May, that's when fly fishing is best. It's surface oriented fishing, although you can fish them through the summer. The story used to be September was good again, that as the water cooled, that the fish kind of came up. Excuse me, but our Septembers have turned into summer. So we're really getting really warm Septembers, and we don't get that return that we used to get. It's all pushed back out of the season. Recall, brook trout closes at the end of September. So we're losing our late summer brook trout season, and it's really kind of focused on May. I don't book any September brook trout days anymore. I used to when I started guiding in this region a handful of years ago, 8 years ago. That was fine. It's really disappeared. So Algonquin Park is where you go for brook trout. Really, there's some other options here. So I've got some. So where would you find this? If you Google FMZ 15 background info, there's a massive document full of research about the fish in this region. So FMZ 15 background document. You can see this is 2022, so modern science. That's a map of what's stocked for brook trout in this area. You notice it's all around the edges of Algonquin Park. So the Ministry of Natural Resources is very purposefully trying to deflect attention away from the native brook trout towards the stocked brook trout. So they're trying to make it easy, and they really want to direct attention there. So here's what I can tell you about the local fishing. Those places all get hammered in winter for ice fishing. People showing up there every day and taking home their limit. So it's really put and take fishing. That's fine. Some of them in spring, you might have some good success. Traditionally fishing with either dry flies or streamers out of your canoe or out of a drift boat or out of a float tube. But many of them are going to get pretty depleted in winter. The further away you get from people, the better it is. Look way up on the top right corner of Algonquin Park. There's a whole bunch of stocked lakes up there. They don't get a lot of traffic. You would be doing okay to go fishing up in those corners. Some of the things down closer on the southern end of the park, and you can see down the southern end of the fishing zone, that's kind of getting down close to Ottawa and Peterborough. Those are going to get fished pretty heavily in the winter. So there's quite a bit of stocking is what you need to know around that. The wild fish are all in Algonquin Park, and they're trying to keep it that way. So you've got options. Realistically, here's what I would tell you about spring fishing. Probably going to be in a pond or a small lake, makes it easiest, and you're going to troll around in a canoe, trolling probably 2 flies, maybe a Mickey fin and some like big-headed, maybe it's something with a big deer head to make some push and some noise. And you're going to wait until you get a tap, and then you're going to stop, reel in, and cast. and you can just sit there and cast, and that's where the fish are going to be. So if you get one tap, there's probably a dozen fish hanging out there. Schooling is not the right word, but they definitely hang out in a pod in the spring, and you fish them and you fish them. And whenever that traffic rolls, kind of dies out, troll around again and go looking for another tap, stop, and then you're going to fish those folks. So that's the way that typically works. The alternative is you could cruise the shoreline about 30 feet out and just cast ashore, strip it back, cast ashore, strip it back. And you can just travel that way, especially if there's trees and rocks and structure around there. So why the shoreline is because it's a little warmer there. There's more sun, right? The bottom's warming up. That's where the minnows are going to be congregating, and that's where the fish are going to be following them in. So those fish are always going to be kind of hidden down and deep and come up and grab it as it's going by. So ambush fishing. Summer you can fish them. I give up because you're really trolling deeper now, and deeper meaning 15 feet. That's where brook trout are. That's the number. So in the Ottawa Valley, 15 feet deep is where the brook trout are. So that means full sinking line all the way out, right? Like backing in the water. You're going to put it all the way up behind you, and you're going to troll in your canoe or in your motorboat very, very slowly, and you're waiting for taps. And then you're going to go back and fish that zone with a sinking tip line or your full sink. But once you find where they are, they're not running, they're there, and you're going to go back and find that spot. So that's not my style of fishing, but I know folks who happily tour in a canoe all day, go trolling around and try to find what they get, wait for a hit. 15 feet, that's the number. If you're a brook trout fisher, you got two options. 6 weight is the generic. I'm going to tell you 6 weight's the standard rod for the Ottawa Valley, because you can troll, you can strip streamers, you can fish dry flies, you can do whatever you want as far as the spring fishing goes. You could also fish lake trout on a 6 weight too in the early season. So that's a pretty realistic one. So I'd say 6 weight rod, sinking tip line, or a sinking leader gives you some options on that. If you're going to be trolling, you'll want a full sink line. If you want to just stick to the little creaky dry fly fishing, 4 or 5 weights, fine. You know, either of those would work. You're just not going to be able to do as quite a good a job throwing a beadhead streamer of some kind whenever it gets to that. So I'm not a big name dropper, but I am going to drop a couple names. I'm going to give you a couple places where you go and catch these fish. So if you're going to come to the Ottawa Valley and try to have easy access to catch brook trout, go to Toohey Lake. Toohey Lake is west of Renfrew, near Dacre. So just capture these words and then go and you can Google Maps them and find them. Toohey Lake is stocked, but it's easy access. It's right off a main road. There's washrooms at the boat ramp. So that tells you there's going to be other people there, but it's stocked. It's pretty reliable to catch fish there, but it also means that lots of other people are there catching fish. So that's Toohey Lake right there. You can see that picture. There's no leaves on the trees. So leaves on the trees come out here around May long weekend, just after May long weekend. When the leaves pop, the bugs pop. So there's no bugs here in May until the leaves come out, and then the bugs get real bad real quick. So that if that window just before the leaves, meaning things have warmed up, the surface the sun is warming up the surface, there'll be much more action in the water. Once the leaves start to come out, the bugs start to bite. The fishing's good, but then it starts to go downhill from that point on because it means it's getting warm. Then the water starts to get warm and the fish start to go deeper. They end up at 15 feet. That's where they hang out for the summer. So Toohey Lake, place to go. I spend a bit of time there, especially early in the year. If somebody's brand new to fishing and all they want to do is catch a brook trout, I'll take them to Toohey Lake because they'll probably catch a brook trout. It's not going to be big. It's going to be stocked there last year, and that's fine. You know, it'll be a 9-inch brook trout, but that's super fun, and we can have as much fun as you want, especially in the evening. You know, the evening hatch, you can dry fly fish there for an hour and a half and have super fun. See where they're rising and just go chase them in your canoe or go chase them in your float tube. Totally doable. All right, that's the brook trout story. Like I said, I've got another whole hour on the Drift YouTube channel. Go check that out. Stocked with lake trout. So there's not a lot of great lake trout options in the smaller lakes. They're in the big lakes or they're in Algonquin Park. Actually, and they're in the big lakes in Algonquin Park too. So I don't know much about lake trout fishing. I don't do it. I'm way too preoccupied with brook trout fishing at the same time of year. But the number here is 15 degrees Celsius. When the water gets to 15 degrees Celsius, those fish are gone. And they're gone deep into the lakes, like 30 feet deep is where they're hanging out to get below the 15 C, right? So wherever the water's got the difference between its upper and lower stratus, the cold water is where they're hanging out. So there's lots of folks say that lake trout fishing is great when the ice is going out, like literally when the ice is shrinking. There's an ice pod in the middle of the lake and you can like float around the outside in your canoe and cast along the edge. I've tried that and had zero success doing it. The only way I've ever caught a lake trout is trolling, and that's fine. That's not my particular appealing style, but one of my guides, Matt, he loves trolling. He likes canoeing, he likes trolling, and he enjoys trolling for lake trout. And even in summer, he'll go in lake trout. He'll actually put 2 sinking lines back to back. So he'll be running 65 feet of line out the back of his canoe all the way out, like full line, no more than 65 feet, 120 feet of line out the back of his canoe, trolling around, waiting for lake trout. Anyways, that's for him and not for me. So there is some stocking of lake trout. Lake trout are in trouble. Water's warming. They grow super slow. So as they're harvested, there's just the return and the replenishment of the population is just so slow. It's not great. And that's well known in the science circles and in Algonquin Park. They're trying to wrap their head around the research around that. So the different colors on this slide are about where is their replenishment stocking and where is their put and take stocking, right? So they have some different strategies for what they're trying to accomplish. Splake stocking. So a little less common than brook trout in our region here, but there is some splake. Why would you be interested in splake? The season is open until December 15th. So you can fish splake all the way through the fall, and they're totally happy to come up to a dry fly in like mid-October, whenever the water's warm on top, the evening sun and warming it up. So splake fishing is super fun, and I do that in October whenever everything else is slowed down because it's so cold. Splake are still turned on and they're still doing their thing. So splake is a combination between lake trout and brook trout, right? So a non-breeding hybrid, and that's clearly put there just for catch and take, meant to take them home and eat them.
Rainbow trout there, Jeff. It's actually year-round season for splake.
Say that again. Sorry.
It's actually a year-round season.
Year-round
for splake.
Awesome.
Yeah,
great. Lots of options. Rainbow trout. There's a couple rainbow trout lakes, but not much in the Ottawa Valley. You can see in the west side of FMZ. There's over on the Perry Sound, Huntsville side. There's some rainbow trout. On our side, hardly any. I can't tell you the reason why. I don't know what that reason would be. They haven't taken to the same extent. All right, walleye. We've got a little window of fly fishing for walleye. Most folks don't chase walleye, but when the season opens in that end of May, there's a couple weeks of it when it's actually pretty good, and you can fish in the rivers. I don't fish them in deep water, like jigging off the bottom. That's standard walleye stuff. You can fish the eddy lines just like you would fish trout, just like you would fish bass. They're still in the river at the end of spawn. Some of them are still hanging out in the rivers, and that's what you're catching is the fish on their way out of their spawning, go into the big water where they'll spend their summer. Super enjoyable, right? And especially if you're looking to take home fish to eat, that's a healthy species around here. That I ethically have no problem with taking those home and eating them. You're going to want a steel leader, right? They've got real teeth. And you're going to fish them. You're just going to swing eddy line. You're going to swing and bring it back up the eddy line, just like everything else. Evenings and early mornings, right? Walleye, they're very light sensitive. They're most active at night. That's because they got big eyes. So midday, you're not going to catch much of them. Having said that, last summer, I had clients catch a ton of walleye in the middle of the day. Amazing, like way more than any other year ever. Really warm summer, and caught a bunch of walleye midday. But anyways, not common for us to be catching them in the middle of summer, in the middle of the day. Anything white, any white minnow thing, you're going to be fine, right? Because recall that these guys are going to be eating those rainbow smelt that are all kind of schooled up in the bottom of these rapids or runouts where these major rivers are. Downside of walleye fishing is you're in the heart of bass spawning season, and they are door to door with each other, and you're going to be totally catching bass at the same time, which is kind of fun, but they're spawning and they're kind of preoccupied, and it actually gets a bit ridiculous. And I've had days where I've just like left an area because I can't cast past the bass, right? And I feel bad that the stupid like same fish 3 times in a row is like, okay, buddy, I'm out of here because clearly you're not getting the message. I'm looking for the walleye instead. But anyways, that's the downside of the walleye scene. Where we can find walleye is where the bass are going to be spawning, which is a tail out of a rapid. So where would you go for walleye fishing? All of our big rivers at the last rapid that dumps into the Ottawa is stellar walleye fishing. So pick a river, Madawaska, Bonnechere, Des Moines, Collonges, the last rapid that dumps into the Ottawa River is going to be good for walleye fishing because they come out of the Ottawa and they don't attain rapids like salmon do. And they're going to basically spawn at the base of those. So the first shoot on the Bonnechere, which is a beautiful spot. So it's downstream of Renfrew. It's called Bonnechere Falls. You can find it on Google Maps. And it's well-known fishing spot, well-known swimming spot in summer, all that other stuff. But in May, that's where you can go and catch walleye. But you can do the same thing, find them at the bottom of the Petawawa, find them at the bottom of the Des Moines or the Black, whatever those are going to be. Walleye. All right, moving on. Musky and pike, I'll kind of like put them together here. We've got lots of musky and pike fishing, and they're a little bit mutually exclusive. So if you got pike in this area, you're not going to have musky, or if you got musky, you're not going to get pike. So this is on the Petawawa River, which is the musky zone, right? There's no pike in the Petawawa River, very little pike. But other ones like the Bonnechere, full of pike and no musky. So so they basically get themselves established, and then they can kind of rule their own little zone. So when are you going to fish for these guys? June is when pike and muskie eat 50% of their annual calories are in the month of June. So they finish spawning in May, and they're super active. Water's the right temperature for them. All the other fish are in spawning and kind of like pooled up right at the base of these rapids, and that's where you can find these guys. So that's the most productive fishing. In fact, can catch multiple muskie in a day, which in the heart of summer it'd be tough to make that claim. And certainly pike on any day you can catch multiple pike, way more aggressive than and easier to catch than the muskie are. They're back. I like to fish pike and muskie again late fall because they're pretty active late in the season, and they're easy to bring up, and in fact easier than in August. When the water's warm, they are really slow and lazy metabolically. Then they wake up again when the water gets cold. So once everything else closes, the bass is kind of like trickled out because it's too cold. Then I'll redirect my attention to go and chase pike and muskie again. So all of our major rivers have either pike or muskie in them, one of the two. The Petawawa and the Madawaska are the muskie rivers, and the Bonnechere primarily, the Calange, the Noir, those are really known as pike rivers. So that's pike fishing. Weed lines, back bays, quiet water. They don't hang out in eddy lines. It's much quieter fishing. So that says poppers work great, or any big mousy thing, or any of the kind of gurglers, or anything that pushes water is always very exciting, especially for pike. They're really happy to come up and grab them. Muskie sometimes yes, and sometimes no. Gear then, these are big fish. This is going to definitely break the 6-weight rule, not because it's going to break your rod, but you want a big fly, and a fly that's way bigger than a 6-weight is going to throw. So you can pick. I was a pretty dedicated 8-weighter. I was pretty dedicated with a 6-weight and an 8-weight. But as flies just got bigger and bigger, and with the Game Changer and the spine flies, they just get heavier and heavier. I now use a 10-weight for much of my pike and muskie fishing. So I don't like it as much, but I do like the big flies. So I'm having fun with those. Definitely steel leader. Definitely you're going to want a big net and a lip gripper to deal with these guys. Not that you're going to pick them up necessarily with the lip gripper, but you want to hold on to them so you can manage the hook without losing your finger. Super fun, and there's some super big fish. There's 3-foot pike is pretty easy and common, and muskie even bigger and heavier than those.
That's awesome. Were there any colors you want to call out in particular for those waters?
Yep. So it seems like the pike are pretty yellow. I can't tell you why, but like as in there's no a lot of yellow forage fish, maybe perchy kind of thing, but definitely going yellow. And then for the muskie, it's brown and white or black and white is the common combos for those. Yep. And that's the sucker colors, right? So that's really what the muskie ends up chasing on those. Yeah, and I'm a fan of those Game Changers really work, right? Those spine flies. So any kind of variation around those that have a big head, big noisy head that pushes underwater, and any of the articulated bodies, it all certainly works. Yep. So where are you going to go? Pike fishing, you can't do better than Wilbur Lake just outside of Eganville. It is unbelievable how many pike are in there. So you can just go and stand up in a canoe and you will see a pike somewhere. There's got to be 1,000 pike in this little lake. So it's small. You could easily canoe it, easily float tube it, and there's a public access. It's rustic. It's not a paved boat ramp by any means, but there's public access to get down and into the water. That's where I go to catch pike, because you're going to catch pike. So super fun there. The other place that's well known around here is in Algonquin Park, further up the Bonnechere River, Booth Lake. It's a bigger lake, and they've got really big pike in there, and it's pretty well known. So you can see the Bonnechere River has basically been infected by pike. They've worked their way upstream, and there's no brook trout left in Bonnechere River. It used to be good, but they've gobbled them up right to the park boundary. They're all the way up right at the base of Opiongo Lake now. Musky, Madawaska, and Petawawa are your rivers for musky. So Claybank Boat Launch, which is right outside of Arnprior, well known in the kayak fishing scene, right? Kayak fishers love musky. So there's a boat ramp there right outside of Arnprior, which is a good spot to put in your canoe or your float tube, because you only need to go a couple hundred meters from the boat ramp to get to some cool weed lines that you can fish musky there. Then the other one's in Petawawa. There's good access at Black Bay. Again, public access in Black Bay. Well traveled. There's going to be motorboats around and all that stuff, but it's well known as a musky bay because it's quiet water, kind of off to the edge of the river itself. So that's pretty accessible, not super secret. Like, those are busy spots. You're gonna see lots of other boats there, and you're gonna see lots of other people fishing elsewhere. Not so much competing with you, but there's definitely well-known fishing spots for chasing those. All right, that leaves us with bass. So we've got really good bass fishing in the Ottawa Valley, as good as you could ask for anywhere. Like, all of Ontario's got really good bass fishing. We just take it so for granted. This summer, I've got folks coming from Oregon, Texas, Virginia, Minnesota, all have bookings to come and fish bass here. So word is out that it's really fun here, and it's really unique. It's really quiet and wildernessy fishing. It's like they just don't have that stuff anywhere else. Last summer, I had folks from Florida. I had folks from Oklahoma. I had a couple from Italy coming smallmouth bass fishing. So, we've just got some pretty unique spots here for the fish that we just take for granted. Lots of other folks find it pretty awesome and pretty exciting, and the word's out that it's fun fly fishing. So the whole summer is good for them, right? We don't need to be too fussy about temperature. We just might modify our tactics a little bit as the water gets warmer. But as soon as the season opens, they're super aggressive, and they chase just about any kind of fly that you're going to be throwing and stripping through the water, all the way into September until the water starts to get cold. So when the water goes below, let's say 12 degrees Celsius, it's pretty tough to fly fish for bass. They're just moving so slow that you're really going to be doing more kind of like sinking jig style fishing, which is jigging and not so much fly fishing at that point. You can fish them anywhere. There's lake fishing, river fishing, small stream fishing. There's lots and lots of options. It's kind of one of those stories. I don't need to talk too much about it because it's so easy to access all the waterways lower down outside of Algonquin Park. All the waterways have bass in them. So early season, you're going to fish bait fish, white, the Scotty McFly's classic, right? Any of those kind of white swimmy things. Summer, you're going to go to crayfish, and you got to figure out if it's a green river or a coppery color river. And then, of course, you've got all the popper family. If you want to be fishing poppers, definitely in the evenings, poppers are better. On quieter rivers, that's calmer water, that's good. The white water doesn't work quite the same way. As summer goes on and gets warmer, the fish get lazier. So we don't have any real end of summer pickup where the bass get frantic and start to eat. They did all their eating back in June. They're actually way slowed down, and you actually have to fish pretty deep and pretty slow. So I would argue early on in the year, it's like fast, exciting fishing, right? So they hit hard and they hit fast. Summer is late summer, August, deeper, slower, much subtler takes. You need to be a little more attuned to what's going on in the end of your line. So you need to feel a little more. I always try to steer beginner fly fishers to early in the year because it's so easy. It's by August, I see so many missed takes. I'm watching and I see that the novice, they just don't feel quite the same resistance on their line that they could be setting, and they're missing them. By August, when it gets slower, that's when the morning and evenings really matter. So midday is fine all summer long until like August 15th to 20th. Then it starts to get pretty stinky warm water, like up in the 80 Fahrenheit, right? Over 25 C. It's going to be pretty slow fishing in the middle of the day, but they'll come up in the evening for all sorts of foamy bugs, all sorts of that stuff. 6 weight's fine. if you want to fish a sinking tip line or a heavy fly, I'm a fan of the feather changers for bass. So I do have a 7 weight that I do a lot of bass fishing on, even though I prefer to use my 6, but just because a bigger fly, and those are pretty fun, and they're certainly going to be work. So there's so little bass fly fishing pressure. You don't need to be super fussy on flies. It's really about finding fish, and travel a little bit to find the structure to where the fish are going to be, and whatever your fly is probably going to work. If you see an obvious rejection, right? So you've got a streamer and there's an obvious turn away. Well, sure, change your fly. Try something smaller, different color, whatever that could be, but generally not an issue for me. As a guide, I have 80% of all my fishing is one fly. It's a crayfish variation, Autumn Splendor. It's crayfish, or it's a woolly bug with legs, kind of looks like a crayfish. It works all the time. Might need to modify it a little bit along the way. So probably a little less exciting to talk about bass just because it's so everywhere, right? It's so prominent and so prevalent. So info, the Fish On, the Ontario Fish Online, the Fish On app, if you've not found this already, if you're going to go traveling somewhere in Ontario, this is the place to start. So they basically have inventoried almost all of the water bodies that are fishable, not the real little streams, but definitely the lakes. Any of the ponds, any of the mid-sized stuff, you zoom right in, click on it, tells you if anything's been stocked in the past and what species you're going to find there. Pretty reliable, but just know that unless it's been brook trout stocked, you're probably not going to catch brook trout. So it might say that it's a brook trout pond. If it's outside of Algonquin Park, the density is probably so low, the odds of catching a fish are pretty low, especially if there's pike and bass in that same pond. Yeah, maybe there's brook trout in there, but they're barely hanging on and you're not going to catch them because there's so few of them. So that's the only thing just to look out for. You might click on a little lake and it'll say, great, we got bass, pike, panfish of all variations and sizes. That looks like very exciting, but you're not going to catch the trout out of there. It's not likely at all. In Algonquin Park, it's a different story because there's much less bass and the density is much higher as far as those go. So the Fish On app totally works. Totally reliable, and they list stocking. So that's certainly if you want to go looking for splake, lake trout, or brook trout, you want to consult this and check out the stocking list. Place like Toohey Lake, it's not a very big lake, and it's getting stocked like 4,000-year-old fish a year. So that can get hit pretty hard in ice fishing and still have fish left over. Any of the big lakes, like we've got lots of big lakes in the valley, and those all have maps. So if you're renting a cottage on any of the major lakes, find the maps in advance and you can go and find where the shoals are and you can fish off the map. So totally reliable. And that's the motorboat fishing end of the world, which, we don't need to really address that. That's big lake fishing. But just recognize that there's lots of options and you can find the info for where the good fishing is. If you're renting a cottage, you definitely want to ask the cottage owner about where the good fishing is, because probably it's right out around the corner in the bay is the place to go. And they can probably also tell you where the pike or musky is in that lake. Every big lake has got either pike or musky in it, and it's going to have mostly smallmouth and maybe a little bit of largemouth in some spots. All right, we've been talking about Ontario. The Quebec side, it's a fundamentally different story because it's managed differently through the ZEC system. So ZEC stands for Zone Exploitation Contrôlée, so controlled harvesting zone. They basically cut up their crown land into local management units, and they each manage their own fishery. So if you're across the Ottawa Valley, any of the northern part of the Ottawa Valley, you're going to be in a ZEC, but the southern part, you're not. So anything below Pembroke, it's not a ZEC. Means all you need is a Quebec fishing license, which is $90 for an out of province person. If you're going to go into the ZEC, you've got to pay a ZEC fee on top of that, which can be pretty pricey. It's $28 to $45 a day to fish in a ZEC. So that's a lot of money, honestly. And there's actually lots of people from Quebec will fish in Ontario just to get out from underneath the ZEC. Having said that, the ZECs are very well managed. They stock very thoroughly. They really keep track of harvests. So they ask you, we actually have to check in at the ZEC. There's a guy will talk to you, usually in English. And on your way back out, he's going to ask how many you harvested, how many you caught. It's like they really keep track. They do a good job. So from that perspective, it's worth the money because they are intensely managing their fisheries. But it's still money that you're going to lay out. And I still hear folks will go and pay the ZEC fees and not catch any fish one day. So that's a little disappointing. spend that kind of time and money. So that's what's going on in the ZEC, and it's the same thing that happens way over in Gaspé for salmon fishing. It's controlled locally on each watershed, has got its own management unit. You can see those management units, they basically line up with the rivers, right? There's the Des Moines, the ZEC, and each of the Fil-de-Grande as you go up the Ottawa Valley. So there's the ZEC story. The ZECs, so let me trace back to history. So remember the Des Moines Gun and Rod Club, it lasted until 1970 because that's whenever the Quiet Revolution happened in Quebec, and Quebec nationalized just about everything and revoked all those private fishing licenses. So Quebec's strategy at that time to manage its own lumber harvesting, timber harvesting, and the ecological impact is they licensed it out to private clubs to basically control their own region. So they gave them big licenses. Same thing happened over in Gaspé, and all those salmon rivers got gobbled up by rich people, and they sat on them for 100 years. 1970, that all got dismantled and turned into a ZEC system instead. So that Des Moines Rod and Gun Club used to have permits on 20,000 acres, massive chunk of land, and that all got stripped away. Now it just exists in the ZEC without any particular ownership or status around those things. So anyway, a bit of the ZEC story, how that exists. It's how they manage their crown land. So so you got to do a bit of research on the ZEC. You got to figure out where you're going, and then you can look up the ZEC itself, figure out the fees, and then you can kind of dig into their webpage. Use Google Translate on the webpage they're not offered in English, even though the person at the counter probably speaks English. The Quebec side of the Ottawa Valley is all almost English and bilingual at least, if not English exclusively. The Pontiac is known as an English county in Quebec. So that's because they come to Ontario for all their services. Okay, winding down here to some of the kind of like other loose ends. So for boats, if you're willing to fish out of a canoe, you've got tons of options. If you've got a float tube, you're going to be you need to do a little work to figure out what the right size of water is. You don't want to be on a really big water in a float tube, but there's lots of little ponds, lots available. If you're limited to a motorboat, as in like you want to be fishing out of a motorboat, you've got to go to that Fish On app and combine with Google Earth to figure out where the water access points are, where you can back a trailer in. So don't assume because it's water that you can get a trailer in there. Many of them are not going to have that access at all. And the locals might drag their old 12-foot piece of junk in there. But if you're careful about your boat, you want a real boat ramp. And that only exists in a couple places, definitely on the big lakes, definitely on the major parts of the river. Ottawa River, there's lots of options for public put-ins. The littler stuff, a little tougher, not as common. There are changes afoot for FMZ 15. I'm not sure if you've been following this. So pretty radical changes been proposed, which I think is just a bargaining chip. Start radical so they can back off in the middle and find something that they're happy with. So there's a movement to bring the bass season forward a week because it's warmer. That's a legit science says that they've done their spawn earlier now than they used to be. There is also a pitch in here to protect native brook trout lakes by banning winter ice fishing on them. And that definitely got the Ontario Federation of Hunters and Anglers upset. But the intention is honest, which is trying to protect the native lakes and direct attention towards the stocked lakes. So stocked lakes, fine, ice fish your brains out, but they're trying to protect the native brook trout lakes so that they don't get depleted. So, but contentious position to start with, but there's recognition about how brook trout are threatened to the extent that climate change is against them, and that they're just a very, very special, unique species with very unique habitat. So trying to protect those. Algonquin Park is protected. It doesn't have winter ice fishing, but there's all sorts of native brook trout fishing all around the edge of the park, right beside those stocked lakes. So they're trying to protect those. They really want to draw your attention that way. Also interesting in the Ottawa Valley is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin First Nation. And there's an active land claim being negotiated right now, as it has been for the last 10 or 15 years. So the current proposed settlement lands has the Algonquin First Nation taking over a whole bunch of crown land around the edges of Algonquin Park. And it's an interesting story that's kind of unfolding right here in my neighborhood. We have a long way to go for reconciliation around First Nations. And because this has never been ceded, there's a lot of work that they're trying to just lay a foundation for what would a plan look like where First Nations folks could take over part of the land that is still available from a crown land standpoint, and manage the forestry and manage the fishery and the things that go with that. So ongoing story, interesting one. It's kind of been through a couple rounds. It's actually they've got a draft proposal in place that they're now debating at the local level. So that's its own story. So let's see. Know before you go, if I'm going to try to like give you some of the hints here. The really interesting stuff in the Ottawa Valley is the back roads that really go and find the little ponds. So that means if you're willing to get out of your motorboat and have a canoe or a float tube, or just to do some hiking, grab a map, Google Earth, and really try to see where those back roads go. There's some really amazing, remote, beautiful spots that's just like 20 minutes off of, off of a main road. Pretty cool spots out there, and lots of them. Tons and tons of back roads. If you're a back road motorbiker or like a gravel biker cyclist, it's like there's so much cool back road riding to do around here. Access. So don't assume there's access. There's actually pretty limited boat launch access. And if it's got a boat ramp, the fishing's not going to be great. Really, it's going to be well hammered from all the locals. So if you can use a boat ramp to go across and then portage up into a littler lake, it's going to be way better over there. The motorboaters don't go there. The ice fishers don't go there. Getting away from the boat ramps is the key. That's where the population goes, and it's well known, those main boat ramps. Bugs are a thing. It's pretty buggy in early June to the end of June. By at dusk and first light, it's like there's some buggy spots. So be prepared for bugs. Bug shirt, and if you're going to use bug spray, that's not great for our fishing lines and not great for our fish. But the bugs are pretty intense. Just so you know, being out in the middle of a lake, you'll be okay. But if you're bushwhacking up into a little stream, it's buggy. It'll astound you how buggy it is. What else? Because it's a bit of a backcountry adventure, be prepared that way. So have water and a rain gear, and you carry a backpack. It's not the kind of place just to head off with your net and your box of flies. You want to be prepared for the day. There's even some spots where I'm carrying bear spray, because I know it's pretty out there, especially if you're seeing bear sign. I keep bear spray in my truck all summer. I don't keep it in my pocket all summer, but there's some certain places I'm going to be carrying bear spray with me. Heart of summer, not so much an issue. Later in summer, probably it's a little more berry because they're feeding and they're a little more active. Want to put one warning across here around big lakes. There's lots of big lakes, and it is big water, so you can get stuck with pretty wavy. If you're out in a canoe or your small boat, it can get pretty wavy, like 5-foot waves on some of those lakes. So certainly keep your head up around that stuff. Life jacket's always going to be a good idea, especially in the early season cold water. Doesn't matter if you can swim or not. You're only going to last a couple minutes in the cold water. So life jackets are certainly, I'm a outspoken fan of life jackets in the paddling world. Last one, cell coverage is pretty limited. Here I am, I'm 4 kilometers off the Trans-Canada Highway, and I barely get 1 bar on my cell phone here. Right? So satellite communicator, good idea if you're really going to go exploring and you want to go dig into the backcountry. A in-reach or a spot's probably a good idea, because your cell phone is not going to work. So there is good EMS coverage. There's wilderness EMS here. So if you do get hurt, the paramedics can go off-road and come and get you. Pretty cool service we have here, but you need to be able to get in touch with them. So that's the last thing that I would put on your plate for that.